The night my family erased me, it didn't happen in a courtroom or a hospital room. It happened in the middle of an ordinary workday between emails and unfinished tasks, with a phone vibrating quietly against my desk. One sentence was enough to redraw every boundary I thought existed between loyalty and survival. I didn't know yet that the same people who dismissed me would soon panic when the lights went out. I didn't know that a birthday dinner would collapse under the weight of secrets, unpaid bills, and a truth no one had bothered to ask about. And I didn't know that the role I'd played for years, the invisible one, the dependable one, was about to become something dangerous. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about what happens when you stop cushioning people from the consequences of their choices, when silence finally answers back, when family love turns out to be conditional, and the condition is how useful you are. If you've ever been expected to give endlessly without being seen, stay with me. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories like this matter to you, you're welcome to subscribe and walk through it with me. The call came while I was standing in the office kitchen waiting for the coffee machine to finish its slow, unreliable cycle. The hum of the refrigerator, the muted chatter from down the hall. Everything sounded normal. That was the strange part. Nothing in the room warned me that something permanent was about to happen. My phone buzzed against the counter, my mother's name lighting up the screen like it always had. I answered without thinking. Habit is a powerful thing. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't say hello. Her voice moved straight to its purpose, clipped and efficient, as if she were canceling a reservation. She told me not to come to the dinner that night. Not to show up. Not to be seen. There was no pause to let the words settle, no softness, just instruction. I remember staring at the coffee stream, watching it darken the glass pot, and wondering if I'd misheard her. Tonight was her birthday. A small family dinner she'd said earlier in the week. Nothing formal. I'd already planned what time to leave work, which route to take to avoid traffic. I'd even bought a gift, nothing flashy, just something I thought she'd quietly appreciate. All of that dissolved in the space of a few seconds. When I asked why my voice came out steady, almost polite. Years of practice had taught me how to ask questions without sounding like a problem. She answered as if the reason were obvious. My sister's fiancé was attending. His family too. People who mattered. People with expectations. And I apparently did not fit into the picture they were trying to present. She said I would make the family look bad. That people would ask who I was, what I did. That she didn't want to have to explain me. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, trying to locate some trace of hesitation in her tone. There wasn't any. She spoke the way someone does when they've already rehearsed the conversation and decided how it should end. She told me I worked behind the scenes, that I didn't belong in rooms like that it would be better for everyone if I stayed away. I asked her what exactly she was ashamed of. There was a brief silence. Not guilt, not doubt, just impatience. Then she said it plainly. I wasn't impressive enough, not visible enough, not something she could point to and be proud of in the way that counted to other people. The call ended without a goodbye. I didn't move right away. The coffee machine beeped sharp and final, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. My reflection stared back at me from the dark glass of the microwave door. I looked the same as I had that morning. Same pulled back hair, same unremarkable blouse. Nothing about me had changed. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. I carried my coffee back to my desk and sat down, my hands steady despite the noise in my head. I opened my laptop to distract myself, to ground myself in something concrete. Emails filled the screen. Numbers, timelines, familiar structures that made sense. At the top of one document, my name appeared in clean, unembellished text. Founder. It wasn't a title I used often. I didn't introduce myself that way. I'd learned early that shrinking made life smoother. I thought about how easily she'd erased me from her evening, how natural it had felt for her to do it. This wasn't an explosion. There was no shouting, no dramatic break. Just a quiet exclusion that carried the weight of every similar moment before it. I realized sitting there that this wasn't the first time I'd been deemed inconvenient. It was just the first time it had been said out loud. For years, I'd told myself my place in the family was flexible, that I didn't need attention, that being low maintenance was a virtue. When plans were made, I adjusted. When priorities were set, I stepped aside. I thought that if I asked for less, I'd hurt less. I was wrong about that. All it did was teach them how much they could remove before I disappeared entirely. I replayed her words in my head not because they surprised me, but because they clarified something I'd been avoiding. She wasn't worried about my feelings. She was worried about appearances, about control, about curating an image that didn't include anything she couldn't easily explain. And I was in her eyes complicated, inconvenient. A reminder that success doesn't always look the way she wanted it to. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, letting the office sounds wash over me again. People laughed somewhere down the hall. A printer whirred to life. The world kept moving indifferent to the quiet fracture happening inside me. I felt strangely calm. Not relieved. Not angry. Just clear. For the first time, I didn't ask myself how to fix it. I didn't wonder what I could change to be more acceptable. Instead, a different question surfaced, slow and unsettling. What would happen if I stopped making myself smaller for people who only noticed me when it benefited them? I didn't answer it right away. I just sat there staring at my screen, aware that something had begun. Not a confrontation, not a plan. Just the end of a habit I'd carried for most of my life, and I knew even then that this call wasn't the worst part. It was the beginning of seeing things exactly as they were. I drove home that evening without turning on the radio. The road curved through the outskirts of Asheville, familiar enough that I didn't have to think about it. That was good. My mind was busy replaying the call, not in sharp fragments, but as a steady draining loop. The words themselves had already lost their sting. What lingered was the certainty behind them, the ease with which my absence had been decided. My house was quiet when I walked in. A small place modest by most standards, but it was mine. I set my bag down, kicked off my shoes, and stood in the kitchen for a moment listening to nothing. No voices, no expectations. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic in the distance. It felt grounding, like stepping out of a room where you'd been holding your posture too long. I didn't intend to check my bank account. That wasn't part of any plan. It was instinct, the same reflex that made me double-check locks before bed or reread contracts before signing. Control for me had always been about preparation, so I opened the app and waited for it to load. The first thing I saw wasn't alarming, just a list of familiar transactions neatly organized by date. Utilities, insurance, service fees. I scrolled slowly, my thumb dragging the screen downward as the pattern revealed itself. The same charges month after month. Electric, water, internet, home insurance, all tied to my parents' address. I sat down at the kitchen table, my phone resting flat against the wood. For a moment, I tried to remember when it had started. Not the first payment, I knew exactly when that happened, but the moment it became normal. The moment no one asked anymore, and I didn't offer an explanation. It had begun quietly, framed as temporary, just until things stabilized. Just until Maribel got back on her feet. Just until my parents figured out their budget. 27 months. I counted twice, then opened the calculator anyway, as if the number might change if I approached it differently. It didn't. $11,306.44. The total wasn't devastating in itself. I could afford it. That was the problem. Because I could, I had. Because I didn't complain, no one checked whether they should. There were no thank you messages attached to those months. No acknowledgement, The payments existed in isolation, like they'd come from some external source, something impersonal and inexhaustible. Not a daughter, not a person, just a solution. I thought about Maribel, about how her name still carried a warmth in our family that mine never had. She was introduced with enthusiasm, with context. Her job titles, her social circle, her relationship status, all carefully explained and celebrated. Mine were glossed over, simplified into something vague and unthreatening. I was the quiet one, the one who worked with computers, the one no one quite understood and therefore didn't feel compelled to defend. I had never corrected them. Part of me believed that staying indistinct protected me, that if they didn't know too much, they couldn't resent it. I didn't flaunt my work. I didn't talk about growth or revenue or the fact that decisions ran through me. I let them believe I was employed by someone else, interchangeable, small. It felt safer that way. Less confrontational. What I hadn't accounted for was how that perception would be used, how invisibility becomes permission. I scrolled back through old messages, through casual requests phrased like afterthoughts. Can you cover this one just this month? We'll sort it out later. Each time I'd said yes without asking for clarity. I'd told myself it was temporary. That family helps family. That I didn't need the money the way they did. I'd mistaken my ability to give for an obligation to do so. The realization didn't arrive dramatically. There was no spike of anger, no rush of betrayal. It was quieter than that. A slow settling of facts into place. My mother's words from earlier echoed back to me, reframed by this new context. She wasn't ashamed of my work. She was ashamed of how it looked, of how it couldn't be neatly packaged into a story she could tell at a dinner table. Behind the scenes. That phrase had followed me my entire life, spoken like a compliment, used like a boundary. It was how my contributions were explained away, minimized without being outright denied. I had accepted it because it came with a kind of approval, conditional, but familiar. As long as I stayed out of sight, things stayed calm. I put my phone down and rested my palms on the table, feeling the grain of the wood under my skin. I thought about how many decisions I'd made based on what would cause the least disruption, how often I'd chosen silence over correction, not because I agreed, but because it was easier, because pushing back always felt like it required more energy than I had. That night, sitting alone in my kitchen, I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. The money wasn't the core issue, it was the expectation. The assumption that my resources were communal while my presence was optional, that my value lay in what I could provide, not in who I was. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel righteous. I felt tired. Tired in a way that went beyond the day or the week. It was the exhaustion of realizing you've been compensating for something that was never yours to fix. I left the app open, the numbers glowing softly on the screen, and asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. If they didn't see me now when everything was running smoothly, what would happen when it stopped? I didn't answer it yet. I wasn't ready for that. But the question stayed with me as I turned off the lights and went upstairs, aware that the balance I'd been maintaining so carefully was already shifting. Some memories don't come back as scenes. They come back as positions where you were standing, where you were told to stay. As I lay awake that night, the numbers from the bank app fading into something heavier, I kept seeing myself at the edges of rooms, not excluded outright, just placed carefully where I wouldn't disrupt the picture. In most of our family photos, Maribel is centered. Even as a child, she seemed to know how to occupy space naturally, how to tilt her head just enough to catch attention. I was usually half a step behind, shoulders angled inward, my presence registered only because I was technically there. No one ever asked me to move, but no one adjusted to include me either. I learned early that visibility was something you were either granted or not. Wanting it didn't make it appear. When I earned a scholarship in high school, the letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember holding the envelope in my hands, rereading the words until they felt real. Full tuition, merit-based. It was the kind of thing guidance counselors talked about with reverence. I told my parents that evening, careful not to sound like I was bragging. My mother smiled and said that was nice. My father nodded, already distracted by something else. The ceremony came and went. I went alone. No pictures, no dinner afterward. It wasn't framed as neglect. It was framed as practicality. They were busy. They knew I'd be fine. When Maribel went through her first serious breakup, the house shifted. Dinners were rescheduled. Phone calls were made. My mother took time off work. Everyone spoke in softer voices as if grief were contagious. I remember sitting at the kitchen table watching the intensity of the concern and wondering what it would feel like to be the reason the world slowed down like that. My mother used to say I was strong. She said it often, usually in response to something I needed. Strong people didn't need reassurance. They didn't need help. They didn't need to be checked on. Strength in our house was a reason to be deprioritized. I believed her when she said it. I took it as proof that I was doing something right. I didn't realize until much later that strength was being used as a convenient excuse. As I got older, the pattern stayed intact. When Maribel struggled financially, it was treated as a crisis. When I worked 2 jobs during graduate school to avoid debt, it was treated as expected. When she moved back home, her room was prepared in advance. When I visited, I slept on the couch. No one said it out loud, but the hierarchy was clear. I was adaptable. She was essential. I internalized that distinction without ever naming it. I learned to present my needs as optional, my successes as incidental. I told myself that independence was freedom, that not relying on anyone meant I couldn't be disappointed. It was easier to frame it that way than to acknowledge how little room there was for me when I asked for more. That framing followed me into adulthood, into my work, into my relationships. I became efficient at disappearing. I could listen without interrupting, contribute without taking credit, support without being seen. People liked that about me. It made things smoother, less complicated. My family especially seemed to appreciate how little effort I required. What I hadn't understood was how those small concessions accumulated. How each unspoken compromise reinforced the idea that my presence was flexible, negotiable, optional. By the time my mother told me not to come to her birthday dinner, the groundwork had already been laid. She wasn't making a sudden decision. She was acting on a pattern we'd all helped create. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet. Quiet in a different way than before. Not the kind that absorbs tension, but the kind that observes it. I started replaying moments I'd dismissed at the time, the offhand comments, the jokes that landed just a little too close, the way conversations shifted when I talked about my work. None of it had seemed cruel in isolation. Together, it formed something harder to ignore. I thought about the money again. Not as a sum, but as an extension of that same pattern. Of course it was assumed I'd cover the bills. I always had. Not just financially, emotionally, logistically. I was the one who smoothed things over, who anticipated needs before they were voiced. I had been trained to fill gaps without asking who created them. Lying there in the dark, I felt the weight of years settle in my chest. Not grief, exactly. More like recognition. I hadn't lost my family that day. I'd lost the illusion that my role was temporary. That one day, if I just waited long enough, things would rebalance on their own. They hadn't. They wouldn't. I got up before sunrise and made coffee, the house still wrapped in early morning quiet. As I stood by the window watching the light creep over the trees, I understood something that felt both small and enormous. Being strong hadn't protected me. It had made me convenient. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped proving how little I needed. If I let the absence speak for itself. The thought scared me, not because I feared their reaction, but because I feared what it would confirm. I didn't make any decisions that morning. I didn't outline a plan or rehearse a conversation. I just sat there holding my mug, aware that the version of myself who absorbed everything without question was finally exhausted. And exhaustion, I was learning, has a way of forcing clarity. I didn't wake up that morning with a decision waiting for me. There was no sharp sense of resolve, no inner speech rehearsed in advance. What I felt instead was a flattening, like something inside me had finally stopped bracing. The day unfolded the way it always did: shower, coffee, the muted rhythm of routine, but without the pressure that usually lived beneath it. I moved more slowly, not because I was uncertain, but because nothing inside me was rushing anymore. The house was quiet in a way that felt intentional. Morning light slid through the blinds and stretched across the floor, illuminating dust I usually ignored. I stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, hands wrapped around a mug that had already cooled, listening to the low hum of appliances. My phone stayed dark on the counter. No follow-up call. No message trying to reframe the night before. The exclusion hadn't been softened or reconsidered. It had simply been delivered and left where it landed. I sat on the living room floor with my back against the couch, knees bent loosely, the carpet pressing into my palms. I opened my laptop out of habit, then closed it again. Whatever needed my attention could wait. For the first time in a long while, I let myself remain in the pause instead of filling it. That alone felt unfamiliar. Silence for most of my life had meant responsibility, something I was supposed to manage before it became uncomfortable for someone else. When I opened my banking app, it wasn't with confrontation in mind. I wasn't looking for proof or reassurance. I already knew what I would see. What I needed was to look at it without softening it. The screen filled with scheduled payments, orderly and precise. Electric, water, internet, insurance. Month after month, uninterrupted. A system built on the assumption that I would always be there, quietly making things run. I scrolled slowly, feeling a familiar resistance rise in my chest. A voice that sounded like reason, like adulthood, like everything I'd been praised for. Don't do this now, you'll complicate things. This isn't the right moment. That voice had guided me for years. It had kept me agreeable, low friction, dependable. It had also taught everyone around me that my boundaries were flexible if they existed at all. My finger hovered over the first payment. I noticed how instinctively I paused, as if waiting for permission, for interruption, for something external to take the decision out of my hands. I realized how often I'd lived in that space, hoping circumstances would shift so I wouldn't have to assert anything directly. Nothing happened. I canceled the first payment. There was no surge of fear, no spike of adrenaline. Just a confirmation screen, and then the absence of something automatic. I moved to the next one, and then the next. Each cancellation felt less like an act of defiance and more like ending a habit that no longer made sense. I wasn't taking something away. I was stepping out of an arrangement that had never been mutual. I didn't write an explanation. I didn't warn anyone. I knew from experience that explanations invited debate, and debate invited pressure disguised as concern. This wasn't a statement. It wasn't a threat. It was a quiet correction. When I finished, I placed my phone face down beside me and leaned my head back against the couch. I waited for the aftermath, for guilt to rush in, for doubt to claw at me, for the familiar urge to undo what I'd just done. None of that arrived. What settled instead was a muted calm, the kind that comes when you finally stop holding something up and realize it hasn't collapsed. The days that followed passed without incident. I went to work. I attended meetings. I spoke when it mattered. Decisions I made were accepted without hesitation. The contrast was hard to ignore. In one part of my life, my authority was understood and respected. In another, I had spent years pretending it didn't exist. It took 7 days for the silence to break. The message from my mother arrived mid-afternoon, brief and urgent. The internet at the house wasn't working. She wanted to know what I had done about it. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of the call from the week before, no curiosity about how I'd taken her words, just expectation intact, uninterrupted. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because I didn't understand, but because of what it revealed. In her mind, nothing fundamental had changed. The inconvenience they were experiencing now had already replaced whatever I might have felt then. My hands knew the old script by heart. Apologize, ask for details, fix it quickly, smooth things over. That version of me was efficient, reliable. It was also exhausted. I didn't respond. I set the phone down and let the moment stretch. Minutes passed, then an hour. The absence of my reply felt heavier than any argument I could have made. I imagined the confusion first, then irritation. The usual solution wasn't appearing. The system wasn't responding the way it always had. More messages followed as the afternoon wore on. The tone shifted. Assumption gave way to accusation. Was I ignoring her? Did I think this was acceptable? Didn't I realize there were people coming over plans that mattered? Each message carried the same disbelief that my silence was a provocation, not a boundary. I didn't answer any of them. That evening, I made dinner for myself and ate standing at the counter. I noticed how steady my breathing was, how my shoulders weren't tight the way they usually were after conflict. Nothing catastrophic had happened. The house still stood. The world hadn't ended. The only thing missing was my intervention. For the first time, I saw how deeply I'd been conditioned to equate love with availability, to believe that care only counted when it cost me something, that my value was measured by how quickly I responded when summoned. Standing there in the quiet, I understood that this wasn't cruelty, it was alignment. And once I felt that alignment settle into place, I knew I wouldn't be able to pretend I didn't see it anymore. My mother's birthday dinner went on without me. I knew that because the messages kept coming even though I didn't answer them. At first, they were practical complaints framed as logistics. The internet was still down. The lights were flickering. Someone couldn't get the music to play. Each message carried the same underlying assumption that this inconvenience was temporary, that I would step in any minute now and restore order the way I always had. By early evening, the tone shifted. I was at home standing in my kitchen with a mug of tea cooling between my hands when my phone vibrated again. 6 o'clock had just passed, the time they would normally start welcoming guests. I didn't need to be there to picture it. The familiar dining room. The table set carefully as if presentation could make up for tension. My mother moving through the house with that brittle efficiency she adopted when things weren't going according to plan. At 6:03 p.m., everything stopped. The messages came in rapid succession, no longer pretending to be polite. The power was out. The water wasn't running. The internet hadn't come back. Guests were already arriving and nothing worked. My phone lit up with missed calls I didn't answer, each vibration more insistent than the last. I imagined my mother standing in the middle of the house, gesturing at outlets, faucets, switches, waiting for something to respond the way it always had. Waiting for me. For the first time, I wasn't there. I sat down at the small table by my kitchen window and took a slow sip of tea. The street outside was quiet. A car passed. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then stopped. Nothing in my world reflected the chaos unfolding in theirs, and that contrast felt surreal. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't retaliating. I was simply living in a moment that didn't require me to fix anything. Another message came through, this one sharper. My mother asked if I had lost my mind. I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for the phone. I noticed instead how my body felt, how my shoulders weren't clenched, how my breathing stayed even. For years, conflict with my family had lived in my muscles before it reached my thoughts. That night, it didn't. The panic I'd been trained to feel on their behalf never arrived. Then Maribel started calling. Her name flashing on my screen pulled something tight in my chest, not with guilt, but recognition. She had always been the first to escalate, the one who translated inconvenience into catastrophe. I let the call ring out. She called again. And again. When she finally switched to text, the words came fast and unfiltered. "What did you do? Everyone is here. You're embarrassing us." I imagined her standing in the dining room, voice raised, eyes scanning for someone to blame. I imagined the guests shifting awkwardly, their smiles stiffening as the illusion of a polished family event cracked. This was the world my mother had wanted to protect me from, the one where appearances mattered more than truth. And now, it was unraveling anyway. Another message arrived. "You've ruined my life." I set the phone down on the table, face down this time, and leaned back in my chair. I closed my eyes, not to block them out but to listen inward. There was no satisfaction there. No sense of victory. Just a steady awareness that something irreversible was happening. They needed me. Not because they wanted me there, not because they valued my presence, but because the systems they relied on, financial, logistical, invisible, had been mine all along. And without them, the structure collapsed quickly. I thought about how often I'd been told I was dramatic when I expressed discomfort. How often I'd been accused of overreacting when I pointed out imbalance. And yet here they were, reacting exactly the way they always had when control slipped out of reach, loudly, publicly, without restraint. The phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. His message was shorter than the others. He asked what I thought I was doing. No greeting, no confusion, just accusation. It struck me then how quickly concern turned into authority when they felt entitled to my compliance. I imagined his voice low and controlled, the way it always was when he wanted to remind me who held power. The difference now was that the power he was used to wielding didn't reach me here. I didn't answer him either. I finished my tea and washed the mug, the mundane action grounding me in my own space. I moved through my house slowly, deliberately, turned on a lamp, checked that the doors were locked. Outside, the sky darkened into evening without any regard for birthdays or expectations. At some point, the messages stopped coming all at once. The frantic pace gave way to long gaps, as if they were regrouping, recalibrating, trying to decide which approach would work next. I knew those silences well. They were never apologies. They were pauses before pressure. I sat on the couch and let myself imagine the scene I wasn't part of. Guests making excuses to leave early. My mother forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Maribel pacing, blaming, unraveling. The house, once so carefully managed, stripped of its comforts in front of people who had been invited to admire it. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was a quiet confirmation. All those years I'd been told I didn't matter, that I was interchangeable, that my presence was optional. None of that had ever applied to what I provided. The moment that stopped, the entire narrative collapsed. Later that night, after the last message went unanswered, I turned off my phone completely. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It wasn't threatening. It felt earned. For the first time, they were experiencing the absence I had lived with for years, and for the first time, I wasn't rushing to make it easier for them to bear. The call that finally broke the silence didn't come from my parents or from Maribel. It came from Ruth. Her name on my screen startled me, not because I didn't expect to hear from her eventually, but because she was the last person I thought would be pulled into this. Ruth had been a constant in my life for as long as I could remember. She wasn't family by blood, but she was the only adult who had ever noticed when I went quiet for too long. The only one who asked questions without trying to manage the answers. If anyone could reach me now, it was her. I answered on the second ring. Her face appeared slightly unsteady, the camera angled too low. Behind her, I could hear noise, voices, overlapping movement, the brittle energy of a room that had tipped past polite discomfort into something messier. She didn't speak right away. She just looked at me, her expression tight with concern. "I didn't know how else to reach you," she said finally. It's chaos here. I didn't ask where here was. I already knew. The house. The dining room that had been dressed up to hide tension. The place where I was never meant to appear that night. Ruth turned the phone slightly and the scene came into view. My mother was standing near the end of the table, one hand braced against the back of a chair, as if it were the only thing holding her upright. Her smile was gone, replaced by something sharper, more frantic. Maribel was pacing behind her phone, pressed to her ear, even though she wasn't on a call anymore. Her movements jerky, unfocused. Guests hovered near the doorway, coats already in hand, pretending not to notice what was unfolding in front of them. Ruth spoke before anyone else could. "Sloane's on the line," she said, her voice steady in a way that felt intentional. She wasn't asking permission. She was announcing reality. My mother turned toward the screen, her expression hardening the moment she saw me. There was no relief in her face. No concern. Just anger that had nowhere left to go. "Look at her," she said, pointing at the phone. "She's doing this on purpose. After everything we've done for her." The words landed with a familiar dullness. I'd heard variations of them my entire life. Ruth didn't respond. She just held the phone steady. My father stepped into frame next, his jaw tight, his voice low and controlled. "Do you have any idea what you've caused?" he asked. "You think it's appropriate to count money when it comes to family?" I felt something settle in my chest. Then, not anger, not shame, clarity. They weren't confused. They weren't hurt. They were inconvenienced. And they were furious that their usual leverage wasn't working. Before I could respond, Maribel's voice cut in sharp and unrestrained. "You've ruined everything," she said. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? You always do this. You always make things harder." I watched her face on the screen, the panic just beneath the anger, and realized how fragile her position had always been. She'd never had to hold things together. She'd never had to make systems work. She'd just assumed someone else would. Someone else had been me. A man stepped into the frame, then his presence quiet but unmistakable. He was tall, composed, dressed in a way that suggested he'd expected to be introduced differently tonight. I recognized him immediately, though we'd never been in the same room before. He was Maribel's fiancé. He looked at the screen, then at Ruth, then back at me. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to register recognition. "Sloane," he said slowly, You're the founder." The room went still. My mother froze. Maribel stopped pacing. Even my father fell silent. The word hung there, unadorned, stripped of context. Founder. Not behind the scenes. Not working for someone else. Not invisible. "Yes," I said. My voice sounded steady, almost distant. "I am." He swallowed. "You're my CEO." No one spoke. I watched as the understanding moved through the room in stages. First confusion, then disbelief, then something closer to fear. This wasn't the revelation they'd prepared for. This wasn't a narrative they could redirect with a smile or a sharp comment. "I didn't know," he said, looking genuinely shaken. "I had no idea you were being treated like this." My mother recovered first. She always did. "That's not what this is," she said quickly. "This is a family misunderstanding." She's being dramatic, but the words didn't land the way they used to. The man beside Maribel was no longer listening to her. He was looking at me at the screen, at the quiet I hadn't broken this entire time. "I'm sorry," he said. And I believed him. I wouldn't have if I'd known I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. The damage had already been done, and not by me. Ruth's hand trembled slightly as she held the phone, her eyes flicking between faces, taking in the shift in power that no one had anticipated. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time I could remember, he didn't seem sure which version of himself to present. Authority didn't fit. Reason didn't fit. Even anger felt out of place. I felt no urge to explain, no desire to defend myself. The truth had surfaced on its own without my effort. That felt important. It meant I hadn't orchestrated this moment. I'd simply stopped preventing it. "I'm going to end the call," I said finally. Not loudly, not sharply. Just enough to be heard. No one argued. Ruth lowered the phone, her face filling the screen again. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly before the call disconnected. I sat there for a long moment after the screen went dark, my phone warm in my hand. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. What I felt was a strange, hollow stillness, like the moment after a storm passes and you realize how much damage was hidden by routine. They had seen me. Not the version they'd minimized. Not the one they'd used. The real one. And there was no way to fold that knowledge back into something convenient. For the first time, the silence that followed didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like space. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, spaced just far enough apart to let the reality sink in between them. I woke the next morning to an email notification I hadn't expected to see so soon. The subject line was formal, almost stiff, the kind of phrasing people use when they're trying to be careful with power they've just realized they don't fully understand. It was from Maribel's fiancé. He apologized again, this time in writing, choosing his words with the precision of someone who knew they would be read more than once. He said he hadn't known. Not about the money, not about the way I'd been treated, not about the assumptions my family had been making for years. He said the call from the night before had changed how he saw everything, not just me, but the foundation of the relationship he was standing on. He asked for time. He asked for distance. He asked indirectly to be moved. I read the email once, then again. Not to analyze it, but to absorb what it meant. This wasn't a dramatic gesture. There was no anger in his tone, no attempt to shift blame. It was quieter than that. Careful. Controlled. The kind of response that comes from realizing you've stepped into a situation where the moral ground isn't where you thought it was. I replied with one sentence. I told him I understood. I told him we could discuss logistics with HR. I didn't offer reassurance. I didn't soften the edges. There was nothing to negotiate. He had recognized the reality and he was adjusting to it in the only way he knew how. By noon, the next message arrived. This one was from Maribel. It was longer than I expected, rambling in places, sharp in others. She accused me of humiliating her, of sabotaging her future, of doing this deliberately. She said I'd crossed a line. She said family didn't treat each other this way. She said I'd always resented her, always waited for a moment to strike. Reading it, I could feel how desperate the narrative was, how urgently she needed me to be the villain, so she wouldn't have to sit with what had actually happened. I didn't respond right away. I let the words sit, not because they hurt, but because they clarified something I hadn't fully named before. Maribel didn't see me as a person who had made a choice. She saw me as a function that had malfunctioned, something that had failed to perform its role at the exact moment it was needed most. I replied later that afternoon with a single line. I told her I hadn't ruined her life. I told her I had simply stopped saving it. There was no satisfaction in sending it, just finality. The formal withdrawal came the following morning. He sent another email, this time brief and direct. He was ending the engagement. He was stepping back from the relationship to reassess what he'd overlooked. He thanked me again for my professionalism. He asked to be reassigned to a different division. He didn't ask for leniency. He didn't assume forgiveness. He was trying in his own way to put distance between himself and something that had revealed more than he was prepared to face. I forwarded the request to HR without comment. The office reacted the way offices always do when something personal intersects with structure, quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. A transfer was arranged. A formal announcement went out. No reasons given. No details shared. From the outside, it looked like a routine adjustment. Inside, I felt the weight of how quickly things could realign once truth was no longer being managed. That afternoon, my phone rang again. This time, it was my father. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was different from the others, not louder, not angrier, but measured in a way that suggested calculation. He said we needed to talk. He said misunderstandings had occurred. He said things had gotten out of hand. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask how I was. He framed the situation as something that had escalated unnecessarily, something that needed to be brought back under control. I didn't call him back. The messages that followed from my mother were more emotional, but no more reflective. She accused me of tearing the family apart. She said people were talking. She said Maribel was devastated. She said I could have handled things privately. The irony didn't escape me. Privacy had never been extended to me when I was the one absorbing the cost. I read everything. I responded to nothing. In the quiet spaces between messages, I noticed how little my life had actually changed. I went to work. I came home. I cooked dinner. I slept. The systems I'd built for myself continued to function unaffected by the chaos I'd stepped out of. That steadiness felt instructive. It showed me how much energy I'd been spending managing emotions that weren't mine to carry. A week later, Maribel sent one last message. It was shorter this time, colder. She told me I was dead to her. She told me I'd chosen money over blood. She told me I'd regret this when I was alone. The message ended without punctuation, as if even anger had run out of fuel. I didn't reply. I set my phone down and sat at my kitchen table, the late afternoon light cutting across the surface in clean lines. I thought about the word choice, how often it had been used against me, as if choosing myself were a betrayal, as if the only acceptable option had ever been to keep giving until there was nothing left. What had happened wasn't a chain reaction I'd set off. It was a collapse that had been waiting for a missing piece. All I'd done was stop holding it together. For the first time, I felt the weight of that truth settle without resistance. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had stepped aside and let it reveal itself. They came a week later unannounced. I knew it was them before I opened the door. There was a particular weight to the knock, hesitant but insistent, that I recognized immediately. It wasn't the casual rhythm of a delivery or the sharp impatience of a stranger. It carried expectation, the assumption that I would answer because I always had. I stood in the hallway for a moment listening. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't bracing. I was simply deciding whether this was a conversation I was willing to have. In the end, I opened the door not because they deserved it, but because I wanted to see them clearly without the distance of messages or the distortion of old roles. They looked smaller than I remembered. My father stood slightly forward as if positioning himself out of habit. My mother hovered just behind him, her face already arranged into something that resembled contrition. It struck me then how practiced that expression was. How easily it came to her when circumstances demanded it. They didn't ask to come in. They assumed they would. I stepped aside anyway. We sat at opposite ends of the living room, the space between us wide and deliberate. No one commented on the house. No one asked how I was. The silence stretched longer than it used to, and for once I didn't rush to fill it. My father spoke first. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said there had been misunderstandings. He said family matters shouldn't involve outsiders. His words were calm, measured, arranged carefully to sound reasonable. He spoke the way he always had when he wanted to regain control of a situation by reframing it as something administrative rather than emotional. My mother followed, her voice softer, threaded with just enough regret to suggest sincerity without committing to it. She said they hadn't meant to hurt me. She said they'd been under a lot of stress. She said Maribel was going through a difficult time and needed support. She said things she thought I wanted to hear. I listened without interrupting. When they paused, waiting for my response, I noticed something new. The urgency I expected to feel the need to reassure them to restore equilibrium never arrived. Their discomfort didn't register as my responsibility anymore. It simply existed. They shifted then, almost imperceptibly. My father cleared his throat and said he wanted to talk about practical matters. He said the house expenses had become difficult to manage. He said utilities, insurance, maintenance, it all added up. He said they needed help. He framed it as temporary, reasonable, inevitable. $2,500 a month. He said the number like it was obvious, like it had already been agreed upon, like my role hadn't changed at all. I asked one question. How much is Maribel contributing? The silence that followed was immediate and complete. My mother looked away. My father's jaw tightened. No one answered. The room filled with the weight of everything that had never been said out loud. The hierarchy, the expectations, the unspoken agreement that my support was assumed while hers was optional. I repeated the question slower this time. There was still no answer. I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, not disappointment. Confirmation. I told them my terms. Either both of their daughters contributed equally, or the house would be transferred into my name. Not partially, not eventually. Legally. Fully. I said it plainly, without embellishment, without apology. These weren't demands. They were conditions. My father reacted first. He slammed his hand against the arm of the chair, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He called me cold. He said money had changed me. He said I was forgetting where I came from. His voice rose, carrying the authority he'd relied on my entire life. I didn't respond to the volume. I responded to the content. I told him money hadn't changed me. It had simply revealed the arrangement I'd been part of for years. I told him I wasn't refusing to help. I was refusing to be the only one expected to. My mother began to cry, then quietly, strategically. She said she didn't recognize me anymore. She said families didn't operate on contracts. She said I was tearing something sacred apart. I watched her tears fall and felt nothing move inside me. I told her families also didn't humiliate their children and then ask them to keep paying the bills. I told her love that only functioned when it was convenient wasn't something I could afford anymore. The room went still. For a moment I thought they might argue again, might push harder, might threaten distance the way they always had. Instead, my father stood up. His face was rigid, his disappointment worn like armor. He said I had made my choice. I agreed with him. I walked to the front door and opened it. I didn't gesture. I didn't explain. I simply waited. The message was clear without words. They hesitated long enough for me to see the calculation flicker behind their expressions. Then they left. I closed the door behind them and leaned my forehead briefly against the wood. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. Whatever they had hoped to recover in that conversation was gone. That night, I sat alone in the quiet and thought about the years I'd spent negotiating my worth, adjusting myself to fit expectations that were never going to change. I realized then that this wasn't a rupture. It was a correction long overdue. They hadn't come to understand me. They had come to renegotiate access. And for the first time, I had said no. After they left, the house didn't feel empty. It felt settled. I stood by the door for a long moment, my hand still resting on the knob, listening to the sound of their car pulling away. Tires on gravel, an engine turning over, the ordinary mechanics of departure. I waited for the familiar ache to arrive, the hollow thud in my chest that usually followed any confrontation with them. It didn't. What I felt instead was a steady quiet, the kind that comes when something unresolved finally reaches its end. I walked back into the living room and sat down where we'd been talking. The cushions still held the impression of where they'd been sitting, shallow and temporary. I noticed how quickly the room returned to itself once they were gone. No lingering tension. No residue. Just space. That was when I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to name before. They hadn't come to reconcile. They hadn't come to listen. They'd come to restore access to money, to convenience, to the version of me that made their lives easier without asking for anything in return. When that version didn't appear, there was nothing else they were prepared to engage with. The days that followed confirmed it. There were no apologies, no attempts to revisit the conversation with humility. Just silence. At first it came in short stretches a day, then two. Then weeks passed without a single call or message, no check-ins, no concern. The absence stretched until it felt deliberate. 2 years have passed now. In that time, my phone has stayed quiet. No birthdays, no holidays, no emergencies that required my attention. The distance has held clean and uninterrupted. I used to think that kind of silence would feel like punishment. I'd been taught to fear it, to interpret it as failure. But living inside it taught me something different. They don't miss me. They miss what I provided. That realization didn't hurt the way I expected it to. It clarified things. It explained the imbalance I'd been living with for most of my life. I hadn't been loved conditionally, I'd been valued functionally. As long as I smoothed problems, covered gaps, absorbed discomfort, I belonged. The moment I stopped, I became disposable. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. My life didn't unravel without them. It expanded in small, quiet ways. I slept better. I stopped checking my phone compulsively. I noticed how much energy I had when I wasn't bracing for the next request or anticipating someone else's needs before my own. The space they left wasn't empty, it was usable. I learned how to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to fix it. I learned how to let other people manage their own consequences, and I learned how deeply I'd equated usefulness with worth. For a long time, I believed that staying meant loyalty, that leaving meant failure, that endurance was proof of love. No one ever told me that sometimes staying is just another way of disappearing. I didn't walk away in anger. I didn't announce my departure. I simply stopped participating in a system that only worked when I gave more than I had. I stopped being the silent infrastructure that kept other people comfortable at my own expense. There's a difference between boundaries and ultimatums. Boundaries don't demand compliance. They describe conditions. I finally learned to state mine and accept what followed. What followed was clarity. Family, I've learned, isn't defined by blood or obligation. It's defined by mutual recognition, by care that doesn't require self-erasure, by presence that isn't conditional on performance. If those elements aren't there, what remains isn't family, it's habit. I used to think leaving would mean losing everything. What it meant instead was losing a role that was slowly hollowing me out. The fear that kept me tethered was never about love. It was about guilt. About being taught that my needs were secondary, negotiable, excessive. Walking away didn't make me cold. It made me honest. If you're listening to this and wondering whether it's possible to choose yourself after a lifetime of being told not to, I won't tell you what to do. I'll only tell you this: the moment you stop acting as a resource and start acting as a person, some people will disappear. Let them. Their absence will teach you what their presence never did. I don't regret leaving. I regret how long it took me to realize I was allowed to. After everything that happened, I spent a long time trying to name what I was supposed to feel. Relief didn't quite fit. Neither did grief. What I eventually understood was that healing doesn't always arrive as an emotion, it arrives as stability, as days that aren't punctured by dread, as nights where your body finally believes it's safe to rest. Walking away didn't fix my past, but it changed my future. It taught me that love isn't proven through endurance, and loyalty isn't measured by how much pain you can absorb in silence. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. Sometimes survival looks like stepping back and letting others face the reality you've been shielding them from. If this story resonates with you, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Stories like this exist because so many of us carry them quietly, believing we're alone in the experience. Thank you for staying with me through this. If you found something true here, something familiar, consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it reminds me that choosing honesty over silence is worth it.